In the heart of a small town, Dr. Edward Hansen was a renowned psychiatrist, known for his ability to read disturbed souls and ease their deepest fears. His calm demeanor and empathy for his patients made him the trusted figure for everyone. After years of working in the heart of the city, Edward decided to take a bold step toward a radical change in his professional life, choosing to move to an old, abandoned clinic on the outskirts of town. The clinic itself was a piece of art, a Gothic building with an ancient architectural style that captured the eye. Its stained glass windows reflected dark colors at sunset, giving it a blend of beauty and terror. But behind this gloomy beauty, the place whispered heavy memories, as if it carried buried secrets it didn't want to reveal. From the moment Edward stepped into the clinic, a strange feeling crept into his heart, a cold sensation like a sudden winter breeze. The dilapidated furniture was scattered everywhere, covered in thick layers of dust, as though no one had dared to approach it for decades. The walls were cracked, emitting a heavy odor of decay, as if they bled stories from the past. However, what caught Edward's attention were the cabinets in the dark corners. As he rummaged through their contents, he discovered old records filled with brittle papers written in a strange language, packed with symbols and geometric shapes resembling ancient talismans. Though he couldn't decipher them, they sparked his curiosity rather than fear. Despite all the alarming signs, his passion for his work kept him going, believing that he could fix everything. Restoring the walls, renewing the furniture, and even getting rid of the unpleasant smell. But what he didn't know was that the trapped souls in those walls wouldn't allow him to tamper with their dark past. And he had entered into a battle with forces from which he couldn't escape. At first, things seemed normal at Dr. Edward's clinic. Patients visited him daily, seeking help for their psychological burdens, and he offered them support with dedication and calm. Among these patients was Clara Peterson, a pale young woman with eyes filled with anxiety. Clara had been suffering from recurring nightmares, describing them in a trembling voice. A dark room with no end, footsteps behind me, and every time I try to turn around, I find something in the shadow. What terrified Edward the most was her repeated phrase, "The spirits are watching us. They are always watching us." Despite Edward's attempts to reassure her, Clara would look at him with an empty gaze, as if she carried a terrifying secret that her subconscious knew but Edward could not understand. A few weeks passed, and one day, Edward noticed Clara's absence from her usual appointment. She hadn't canceled, which raised his concern. He tried calling her repeatedly, but her phone remained silent, and the ringing sound was like a nightmare, carrying a warning of something dreadful. Despite his efforts to ignore the matter, Clara's last words echoed in his mind. "If you don't leave this place soon, the spirits will begin to haunt you too." Those words started to creep into his thoughts like thick smoke, overwhelming him with a feeling that something terrible had occurred. As the days went by, a strange sensation crept into his heart. The nights at the clinic were different. The sounds from the walls, the shadows moving under the moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows, everything seemed to call his name. One dark night, while Dr. Edwards sat in his office, buried in reviewing his notes, he heard the sound of slow footsteps echoing in the hallway leading to the waiting room. The sound was faint but regular, as though someone was wandering the place with hesitant steps. He lifted his head and stared at the open door, hesitating for a moment before deciding to get up. He went out into the hallway, expecting to find a patient who had unexpectedly returned, perhaps Clara. But the hallway was completely empty, eerily silent. However, there was something strange. The air felt different. Thick and cold, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were breathing with him, pressing on his chest and sending a shiver through his body. When he returned to his office, his eyes froze at the scene before him. The patient chair, which had been empty just moments ago, was now turned upside down in an odd manner. On its overturned wooden surface, there were small footprints stained with mud, as if someone had just stood on it. A strange feeling of tension and fear began to seep into his soul. He tried to ignore what he saw, thinking it was just a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But he didn't know that this moment was the beginning of his descent into a living nightmare. After a long day of work with one of his patients, Edward stepped out of the clinic late at night. His body was weighed down by fatigue, and his eyes struggled to stay open. As he passed by the clinic's large window, he paused for a moment to glance at his reflection. But what he saw was not a normal reflection. In the dark glass, he saw a face that closely resembled his own, but it wasn't him. The face was horribly distorted. Black, hollow eyes as though life had been drained from them, and a twisted mouth that formed a grotesque smile, exuding the scent of death. Edward froze in place, his body stiffening as if something invisible had tightened its grip on him. He tried to convince himself that it was just a trick of the light, a distorted reflection due to the faint street lighting or the exhaustion that had worn him out. But he couldn't ignore that this doppelganger was staring directly at him, its gaze penetrating into his soul. And worst of all, when he turned his head to look behind him to make sure, there was no one there. He turned back to the window, but the face had vanished. Only his normal reflection remained, pale and disturbed. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the clinic grew even more oppressive and terrifying. During a session with the patient, Frederick Anderson, the lights in the room began to flicker rapidly, leading Edward to believe there was a problem with the electricity. But everything turned into a nightmare when Frederick suddenly stopped speaking and looked behind Edward, whispering with trembling voice, "There's a woman standing behind you. Her face, it's not natural." Edward's breath caught in his throat, and he fought the urge to turn around, but he felt something unseen following him. When he finally turned, there was no one behind him, but the air in the room grew heavy, and the walls seemed to breathe. Then he heard a faint moan, as if something horrific was approaching. Frederick, who had been watching with wide eyes, began to whisper, "She never leaves." Those words left Edward in deep terror, as he faced something beyond even imagination. After that terrifying incident, Edward could no longer ignore what was happening. He had to uncover the secret behind this cursed clinic. His curiosity, mixed with fear, led him to investigate the building's history, and what he discovered was enough to awaken his worst nightmares. It turned out that the clinic, in the 19th century, had been used as an asylum for the mentally ill, but it wasn't a place for treatment. It was a site of horrific crimes. The former director, Dr. Victor Luther, had been a doctor with a terrible reputation, obsessed with the idea of fixing the human mind at any cost. Luther performed unethical experiments on patients, using electric shocks, extreme isolation, and sometimes starvation as methods to reprogram their minds. Many patients died in horrific ways under his hands. Some breathed their last during the brutal sessions, while others ended their lives by their own hands to escape the torture imposed on them. The old records that Edward found indicated that these tormented souls never found peace, as if they were trapped in the clinic between life and death. One night, as Edward was inspecting the building, strange sounds, like whispers, led him to an abandoned basement he had never visited before. Dust covered everything, and the foul stench that reached his nose made him feel nauseous. He began searching in the dark until he discovered a hidden door behind an old cabinet. He opened the door with difficulty, only to find himself in a narrow room resembling a dungeon. The walls were covered with carved writings, written in ancient languages he didn't recognize, but they seemed to carry terrifying threats. Edward was able to translate one of them. "You will suffer as we suffered." In one corner of the room, he saw old tools used for torture. Metal masks, rusty clamps, and blades that resembled knives but were covered with dark stains that were clearly dried blood from years ago. At that moment, it felt as though the room came to life. The whispers that had once been faint turned into screams and moans, and the air grew so thick that breathing became difficult. He felt a cold hand touch his shoulder, and when he turned, there was no one there. But he saw a long shadow crossing the wall, slowly making its way toward him. Edward ran out of the basement, his heart pounding as if it would burst from his chest. But even after he shut the door behind him, he felt the angry spirits that haunted the clinic begin to chase his steps, as if they had finally found someone they could seek revenge on. One dark night, Edward awoke to a loud, piercing scream that echoed from the waiting room. His heart raced in his chest as he looked up at the wall clock, which indicated it was very late, and no patients should be in the clinic at that hour. His eyes raced with his mind, trying to explain what was happening. Edward cautiously approached the source of the sound, which seemed to grow louder, coming from deep within the walls themselves. When he reached the door of the waiting room, he slowly opened it. But what he encountered was not what he expected. The room was engulfed in thick, gray fog, saturated with an old, foul odor. Visibility was nearly non-existent, but within the mist, Edward began to distinguish some distorted shapes. There were ghosts, spirits of the former patients who once filled the place. But their faces, they were inhuman, twisted in ways beyond belief. Their eyes were empty, but within those eyes, there was an anger and hatred that radiated from them. Then, among the ghosts, one figure appeared that Edward couldn't mistake. Clara, the girl who had been suffering from nightmares about the endless dark room. But this time, she was not the same. Her face was covered in deep, deliberate wounds, as if time itself had torn her face apart. Her eyes were vacant, devoid of the spark of life, as though she remained trapped in an endless torment. Slowly, she advanced toward Edward, and when she got close, she whispered in a weak voice, laden with unbearable bitterness, "Why didn't you help us?" The question pierced his mind like a dagger, and with every word echoing in his ears, he felt a heavy weight pressing on his chest. He felt the ground beneath his feet tremble as if it were about to collapse, and at that moment, he realized there was no escape. That he tried to run toward the door, but he sensed unnatural movement in the air. The doors and windows began closing on their own, like an invisible hand pulling the place toward its doom. The sounds grew louder in a terrifying crescendo, and the room seemed to shrink, as if it were breathing rapidly. consuming the air around him. Then, blood began to drip from the walls, drop by drop, in a nightmarish, unbearable scene. The blood flowed slowly from cracks, and the spirits, who were advancing toward him with slow, terrifying steps, came closer until he could feel their cold breath on his face. The closer they got, the more intense the pain in his body became, as if his limbs were freezing and decaying at the same time. The screams grew louder in his head, and with every movement of the spirits around him, his pain intensified. It was not just physical pain, but a deep spiritual agony, as though every torment the patients had endured was now passing through him, becoming part of him. He could no longer breathe. His heart was pounding frantically, and the closer the spirits got, the more he felt something black seep into his mind, dragging him toward madness. He closed his eyes, trying to escape the reality, but he couldn't. The spirits were there, and they would never let him flee. One morning, a nurse entered Dr. Edward's clinic to find a terrifying surprise. Edward was sitting in his old chair, his eyes wide open as if they had witnessed something unspeakably horrific. He was mumbling incoherently, his head slowly shaking. When the nurse approached Edward, he was shocked by the madness in his eyes, and Edward whispered to him, "You can't leave. They're watching us all." The words struck like a thunderbolt, reflecting a deep terror in the atmosphere of the clinic. When a local resident tried to check on Edward, he was stunned to see him surrounded by papers covered in terrifying, repetitive words. "The walls speak, the spirits watch, the doctor is mad." He laughed hysterically, his eyes glowing with utter madness. And when he finally whispered, "I am the doctor and the patient. This is my fate," it felt as though his heart had stopped beating. Edward had fallen into a trap of endless nightmares, his eyes now watching the walls of the clinic, which had become filled with echoes of the past, forever watching anyone who approached, awaiting more victims.